I am a patrol officer. I work the day shift in a precinct that covers a heavily residential area. We get a lot of noise complaints, minor traffic collisions, and property disputes. We also get a large number of wellness checks. A wellness check is usually called in by a neighbor or a family member who has not heard from someone in a while. Most of the time, the person is just out of town, or their phone broke, or they simply do not want to talk to anyone. Sometimes, we find them injured on the floor after a bad fall, and sometimes, we find that they have passed away quietly in their sleep. The call came over the radio just after lunch. Dispatch told me that a resident had called the non-emergency line to report a foul odor coming from the house next door. The caller also mentioned that the homeowner, an elderly man who used to be a medical doctor, had not been seen outside for over a week. The doctor was a known recluse. He never had visitors, never received mail other than utility bills, and only left his property to buy groceries. I acknowledged the call and drove to the address. The house was located at the end of a dead-end street. The exterior of the property was in severe disrepair. The front lawn was completely overgrown, with weeds reaching up to my knees. The paint on the wooden siding was peeling off in large, gray strips. The windows were entirely covered from the inside with thick, yellowed newspaper, preventing anyone from looking in. I parked my cruiser on the street and walked up the cracked concrete driveway. As soon as I stepped onto the front porch, the smell hit me. It was a heavy, dense odor. If you have been on the job long enough, you learn to recognize the smell of human decomposition. It has a specific, sweet, sickly scent that sticks to the back of your throat. But this smell was different. It had the underlying rot of decay mixed heavily with the sharp, burning scent of raw ammonia, stagnant water, and molding paper. It smelled like a swamp had been left to bake inside a closed plastic container. I knocked heavily on the front door and announced my presence. I waited 30 seconds. There was no response. I knocked again, louder. This time, the house remained completely silent. I reached down and turned the brass doorknob. The lock was not engaged. The door clicked and pushed inward, but it only opened about 6 inches before the wood hit something solid on the other side. I pushed my shoulder against the door, applying my body weight. The obstruction on the other side scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, yielding just enough for me to squeeze my body through the narrow gap. I stepped inside the house and immediately started choking. The air quality inside was terrible. The dust was so thick I could taste it on my tongue. I pulled my flashlight from my duty bell and turned it on. The homeowner was a severe hoarder. The living room did not exist. From the floor all the way up to the ceiling, the entire space was packed tightly with garbage. There were massive, leaning towers of old cardboard boxers, plastic bags filled with rotting food, and piles of broken, unidentifiable furniture. The only way to move through the house was a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel carved through the center of the trash. The tunnel was barely wide enough for a person to walk sideways. The walls of this tunnel were made of tightly compacted stacks of yellowed newspapers. I unholstered my radio and told dispatch that I had made entry, that the house was a severe hoarding situation, and that I was proceeding slowly to locate the homeowner. I stepped into the tunnel. I had to turn my body sideways, keeping my hand resting on the butt of my sidearm to prevent the holster from catching on the debris. The floor beneath my boots was soft and unstable, covered in layers of discarded clothing and wet trash. I called out for the doctor again. My voice was entirely muffled by the sheer volume of garbage absorbing the sound. I moved the beam of my flashlight across the walls of the tunnel as I squeezed forward. Poking out from between the stacks of newspapers and cardboard boxers were pieces of broken retail mannequins. There was a plastic, flesh-colored arm extending across the path. Further down, the bald, featureless head of a mannequin stared blankly at me from a pile of empty tin cans. The plastic limbs were scattered everywhere, buried randomly in the walls of trash, making it look as though dismembered bodies were trapped in the garbage. The layout of the house was impossible to determine. The tunnel wound left and right, completely ignoring the original architecture of the building. I walked deeper into the maze. The smell of ammonia and rot growing stronger with every step. The passageway became tighter. I had to suck my stomach in to push between two massive, leaning pillars of bundled newspapers. As my utility belt scraped against the paper, one of the pillars shifted. The stack collapsed. Hundreds of old newspapers slid down from the ceiling, burying my legs up to my knees and completely blocking the path behind me. Dust billowed up into the narrow space, making my eyes water and forcing me to cough aggressively. I stood still for a moment, waiting for the dust to settle, ensuring the rest of the garbage wall was not going to cave in and bury me alive. I looked down at my boots. The floor was covered in the fallen newspapers. I shined my flashlight on the papers around my legs. The beam caught the bold black ink of a headline. I looked at the newspaper directly next to it. It had the exact same headline. I crouched down slightly, restricted by the narrow walls of the tunnel, and moved the light across the scattered papers. They were not different editions. Every single newspaper that had fallen was the exact same copy. They were all open to the exact same page, all displaying the same article. I focused the beam of my flashlight on the text of the article. The paper was old, brittle, and stained with water damage, but the print was still legible. The article detailed a criminal trial. It told the story of a local medical doctor who had been arrested and charged with manslaughter. The doctor had performed a routine tonsillectomy on a little girl. During the surgery, something went wrong. The child bled to death on the operating table. The prosecution had argued that the doctor was under the influence of narcotics during the procedure and had caused a fatal laceration. However, the article reported that the charges against the doctor were entirely dropped. The blood evidence had been mishandled by the laboratory, and without it, the judge ruled there was a lack of evidence to proceed. The doctor walked free. I read the second half of the column. It detailed the aftermath of the trial. The father of the little girl was completely devastated by the verdict. He had caused a disruption in the courtroom when the dismissal was announced. 2 days after the doctor was released, the grieving father drove his truck to the edge of the large river that cuts through the center of our county. He left his wallet and a suicide note on the driver's seat. The note stated that he could not live in a world where the man who killed his child was allowed to breathe. The police report in the newspaper stated that the father threw himself into the deep, fast-moving currents of the river. The water search teams dragged the river for a week, but they never found his body. The currents were known to pull debris deep underwater and wash it out toward the delta. I stared at the yellowed paper. The doctor living in this house was the man from the article. He had retreated into this hoarding nightmare out of guilt or paranoia, collecting the printed proof of his own ruined life. Before I could stand back up, I heard a sound. It came from deeper inside the house, past the end of the paper tunnel. It was a wet, metallic scraping sound, followed by a low, weak groan. I instantly dropped the newspaper. I drew my service weapon with my right hand and held my flashlight with my left, crossing my wrists in front of me. "Police Department," I yelled, my voice harsh in the dusty air. "Call out to me. Are you injured?" There was another weak groan, followed by the sound of something heavy straining against wood. I pushed forward. I kicked the pile of newspapers out of my way and squeezed through the remainder of the trash tunnel. The hallway finally opened up into what used to be a master bedroom. The bedroom was mostly clear of garbage, pushed to the corners of the room. The smell of raw, rotting meat was overpowering here, burning the inside of my nostrils. I pointed my flashlight directly ahead. The elderly doctor was pinned to the far wall of the bedroom. He was wearing a torn, dirty dress shirt and slacks. His arms were spread wide, and his feet were hovering a few inches above the floor. He had been crucified against the drywall. Someone had driven long, thick, industrial metal screws directly through the palms of his hands, pinning them into the wooden studs behind the wall. More screws were driven through his forearms, his shoulders, his thighs, and his ankles. The metal heads of the screws were sunk deep into his flesh. Dark, dried blood stained the wall behind him, running down in long streaks to pool on the floorboards. Fresh, bright red blood was still slowly leaking from the wounds on his chest. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. His head hung forward, his chin resting on his chest. He was alive, but he was completely unconscious, his body going into profound shock. I stepped fully into the room, my boots sticking to the drying blood on the floor. I keyed the microphone attached to the shoulder of my uniform. "Dispatch, I need emergency medical, right now. I have a victim with severe trauma. Multiple puncture wounds, barely conscious. I need an ambulance on a rush, and I need backup units to secure the perimeter." The dispatcher responded immediately, confirming the request and telling me the units were en route. I kept my weapon raised, sweeping the beam of my flashlight across the dark corners of the bedroom. The closet doors were broken. The window was boarded up with thick plywood. The room appeared empty. I took a step toward the doctor on the wall, intending to check his pulse and see if I could relieve any of the pressure on his pinned limbs without causing him to bleed out. As I shifted my weight, I heard a sound directly behind me. It sounded like wet, heavy meat dragging across the hardwood floor. I froze. I did not turn around immediately. The hair on my arms stood up. My training kicked in, telling my brain to process the audio before moving. The sound was a continuous, dragging friction. Then, a voice spoke. The voice came from the dark opening of the trash tunnel I had just walked out of. It was a deep, raspy voice. It sounded incredibly wet, as if the speaker's lungs were completely full of fluid. Each word was accompanied by a bubbling, gurgling sound.
"I always thought I was a good father,"
the voice said slowly in the dark. I tightened my grip on my firearm.
"that I will not be like mine."
The voice continued, ignoring the fact that a police officer was standing in the room.
"I won't leave my child. I won't allow the world to be cruel to her. And yet, here I am, a monster like he was."
I spun around rapidly, raising my weapon and pointing my flashlight directly into the mouth of the trash tunnel. "Show me your hands!" I screamed. "Do it right now!" The beam of my flashlight hit the figure standing in the doorway. The rational part of my brain, the part that understands human anatomy, simply stopped functioning. It was a man, but only barely. He was completely barefoot and wearing only a pair of ruined, mud-stained pants that clung tightly to his legs. His entire torso was exposed to the cold air. His skin was not the color of a living human. It was a sickly, pale, translucent gray, severely wrinkled and resembling a corpse that had been submerged in a lake for months. His chest and stomach were covered in deep, jagged cuts. The cuts were not random. They had been carved intentionally into his gray flesh. Two thick, curved slices were positioned high on his chest, resembling closed, smiling eyes. A massive, gaping slice curved across his entire abdomen, curling up at the ends to form a massive, grotesque smiling mouth. Below one of the eye cuts, a single, deep teardrop shape had been carved into his ribs. His torso was a smiling face with a tear. Blood and thick water oozed from the wounds, but his arms were the reason my mind broke. His arms did not look like human limbs. They were incredibly, impossibly long. They extended from his shoulders all the way down to the floor, dragging heavily against the wood. The bones inside his arms looked as though they had been broken in dozens of places and left to heal at completely random, unnatural angles. The limbs twisted and coiled like thick, gray ropes, running down the inside of his forearms. From his elbows to his wrists, his flesh had the skin was raised in thick, circular ridge. Inside the center of each ridge was a dark, pulsing hole. They were suckers. They were massive, fleshy, octopus-like suckers running down the length of his broken, elongated arms. The suckers continuously expanded and contracted, making wet, popping sounds in the quiet room. I felt bile rise in the back of my throat. I kept my weapon aimed directly at the center of the carved, smiling face on his chest. "Stop right there," I ordered. My voice was shaking. I could not control the tremor in my hands. "Do not take another step. You are severely injured. Emergency medical is on the way. Just stay where you are." The man did not look down at his mangled, twisted arms. He did not seem to feel any pain. He slowly lifted his head, allowing the flashlight beam to hit his face. His facial features were bloated and distorted by water damage, but I recognized him. I recognized the shape of his jaw and his nose from the small, grainy, black and white photo printed in the thousands of newspapers scattered in the hallway behind him. He was the father of the little girl, the man who had thrown himself into the river years ago. He took a slow, heavy step forward into the bedroom. His wet, bare feet slapped against the floor. His long, twisted arms dragged behind him, the fleshy suckers gripping and releasing the wood with sticky, tearing noises.
Down below,
"The father said." His mouth opened and murky, brown water spilled over his bottom lip, running down his chin.
in the deeps of the river, it offered me a chance, a vengeance, and I took it.
He took another step closer. The smell of ammonia and stagnant mud rolling off his body was entirely suffocating. "Stop!" I yelled, tightening my finger on the trigger. "I will shoot you. Stop walking." He ignored my weapon completely. He looked past me, staring at the unconscious doctor, crucified on the drywall.
Look what it made me now.
The father whispered, his voice cracking with a profound, crushing sorrow.
A monster.
The fleshy suckers on his forearms flexed violently, grabbing the floorboards and pulling his long arms forward, coiling them near his knees. He turned his eyes back to me. His eyes were milky white, completely blind, yet he looked directly into my face.
If I die,
The father asked, with the water bubbling in his throat.
if you kill me now, could I see her in the place she went?
He stopped moving. His shoulders began to shake. He was crying, but no tears fell from his white eyes. Only dirty water leaked down his cheeks.
But what if I went there as the monster I am now? No, I can't die. I can't make her see me like this.
The sorrow in his face vanished, replaced instantly by pure, feral desperation. He lunged at me. His movement was incredibly fast and completely unnatural. He threw his long, broken arms forward. The massive sucker slammed against the hardwood floor, sticking instantly. He used his arms to violently pull his torso forward, launching his entire body through the air directly at my chest. I did not think. I just reacted. I pulled the trigger of my service weapon. The gunshot was deafening inside the small bedroom. The bright muzzle flash illuminated the room for a fraction of a second. The bullet struck him directly in the center of the chest, right in the middle of the carved, smiling face. The physical impact halted his momentum in the air. He fell hard onto the floor, landing just inches away from my boots. He did not scream. He simply lay there. His long, twisted arms twitched rapidly for a few seconds, the suckers expanding and contracting wildly, trying to find purchase on the wood. Then, his body went completely still. A thick pool of dark, muddy blood began to spread rapidly out from under his pale, gray torso. I backed away until my shoulders hit the wall near the crucified doctor. I kept my weapon aimed at the father on the floor. I stood there, breathing heavily, the ringing in my ears slowly fading. 5 minutes later, I heard the sound of heavy boots crashing through the front door, followed by officers yelling to announce themselves. They pushed through the narrow trash tunnel, finding me standing in the bedroom, my guns still drawn. The paramedics arrived shortly after. They used heavy bolt cutters to shear the heads off the industrial screws, carefully pulling the unconscious doctor off the wall. They managed to stabilize his bleeding and rushed him out to the waiting ambulance. The crime scene technicians secured the bedroom. They placed a tarp over the body of the father. I was escorted outside by my sergeant. He asked me standard protocol questions. He asked if the suspect was armed, if he had charged me, and if I had felt my life was in immediate danger. I answered yes to all the questions. I am currently on administrative leave while the department investigates the shooting. It is standard procedure when an officer discharges a weapon. The preliminary report states that I shot a home invader who had severely tortured the homeowner. They are assuming the suspect was heavily under the influence of synthetic hallucinogen, which they claim accounts for his strange behavior and his physical state. They told me the suspect had likely been living in the river drainage pipes near the property, completely isolated and driven insane by drug use. They explained away the arms by saying the suspect suffered from a severe, untreated bone disease and untreated skin infections caused by the dirty water. They are trying to put logic onto something that has no logic. I read the preliminary report and I just nodded. I did not argue with my sergeant. I did not tell him what the man had said to me. I am sitting here, staring at my blank kitchen wall, trying to process his final words. I keep thinking about the sheer, terrifying implication of what he told me. I shot him. I killed him. If there is an afterlife, I sent him there. I forced him to walk into the light wearing that gray skin, dragging those broken, suckered arms behind him. I just wanted to do a routine wellness check. Now, I cannot stop thinking about a little girl running to hug her father, only to find a monster waiting for her in the dark.